Kia ora, welcome to Shared Lunch, brought to you by Sharesies with BusinessDesk. Sharesies is a wealth development platform whose purpose is to create financial empowerment for everyone. My name is Frances Cook. I'm the investment editor at BusinessDesk, and we have a special offer for Sharesies investors from BusinessDesk. If you use the promo code SharedLunch100, you'll get $100 off an annual subscription to BusinessDesk, which is usually $249, including GST. Now, the offer only applies to new BusinessDesk subscribers, can only be used once per subscriber, and can't be used with any other discounts. Before we get started, here's some important information. Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of recording. Investing involves... Also, just a quick reminder, if you have any questions for our guests today, you can submit them through the Ask a Question button down below. Don't leave questions in the discussion area as they are likely to get missed. You guys always have great questions. I do not want to miss them. Please do be kind and respectful towards our guests and your fellow viewers. Otherwise, we will unfortunately take steps to remove you from the webinar. Now, today we are talking all things hydrogen. The world is lurching towards decarbonisation, but where exactly does hydrogen, particularly green hydrogen, sit in all of this? We have two guides through this topic today. First up, Simon Coates. Simon is an expert in resource economics. Also joining us is Guy Waipara. He is the General Manager of Development at Meridian Energy. So welcome to you both.
Welcome. Well, thanks, Francis.
Kia ora, Francis.
Well, we'll start with you, Guy. What is green hydrogen? Why are we even interested in it?
So it's probably easiest to talk about what green hydrogen is by talking about what it isn't. So there's a whole bunch of colours on the spectrum that are being used to describe hydrogen these days. And apart from green, they all come from fossil fuels. So if you hear kind of brown hydrogen or black or blue, the origin of that product is usually gas, coal, or oil. And the reason why we're interested in it is that the production of hydrogen, it's one of those substances that, it's abundant and it's in elements or, it's in water and everything. But its use is a kind of, you could say almost boring, but, those things that people don't think about a lot. So petrochemical industry uses a lot for oil refining, and also the fertilizer that you use to grow your food, the majority of that's made from, has got a fossil fuel and a hydrogen source. So where green hydrogen's become of interest is there is another way of producing this product, and that's from taking water and splitting it into its two parts, hydrogen and oxygen. And the way you do that is through a process called electrolysis. So all you do is add electricity, and then boom, you've got a hydrogen stream and an oxygen stream. And that means compared to the grey, blue, brown alternatives, you've got no carbon emissions. So at the moment, the production of hydrogen accounts for around about 3%, I think, of total global carbon emissions, which, everything's material and everything adds up. So why people are interested in green is to start to look at how do you decarbonise those use cases, but also there's other things you can start to think about using hydrogen for to decarbonise things like transport and other kind of industrial processes. So it's looked at as one of those kind of vectors or fuels that could play a huge role in decarbonising the globe.
Yeah, I feel like I've heard a lot of talk about it in relation to often transport and the heavy forms of transport. I mean, Simon, what are some good uses for green hydrogen when it's being used as a fuel source? And do we use them in New Zealand at this point in time?
In terms of good uses for hydrogen, well, as Guy said, there's a whole range of different possible uses for hydrogen, whether it be the uses he described where you need a molecule, for a chemical process such as producing fertilizer or reducing iron for steel or in creating methanol. But you can also use it as an energy source. You can either burn it directly or through an engine, or you can run it through a fuel cell, which is basically an electrolyzer in reverse. You take the hydrogen and you combine it with oxygen and you get water at the end. There are the issue about good uses for hydrogen is it going to be competitive against the alternative environmentally friendly use? And for a lot of those alternatives, it's direct electric, so electric vehicles, for example. In some uses, the alternative will be fuels from biomass. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, yes, I think there are some good uses, and clearly the chemical options are ideal. So in Sweden, they've just started a steel mill, which is using green hydrogen and has avoided the need for coal. I think that's an excellent use. Green hydrogen for fertilizer, similarly excellent. And in New Zealand, Balance is starting to explore that. In terms of the energy-based uses, I think it's where electricity is difficult to use. And so for some off-road transport, for example, some mining trucks and the like, I personally am, in the New Zealand context, less optimistic about it being economic for trucks or and it just doesn't seem to make sense for heating as opposed to using fuels like heat pumps and the like.
Yeah, walk me through some of that, because I know that there's a little bit of a tension there of whether, the certain types of energy uses and the fuel needs that we have in New Zealand, whether they are suitable for green hydrogen. So walk me through in a bit more detail there of what are New Zealand's energy requirements? Does green hydrogen work for that? And if it does or doesn't, do we end up doing something like exporting instead?
Right, so good question. So in terms of our big energy uses in New Zealand, which are responsible for the majority of our emissions, transport is the number one, and that's the big one. I think the main competitor there for transport is electric vehicles. I think there's no debate anymore that for cars and vans, electric is going to be the most cost effective. There is still some debate as to whether heavy trucks may be more suitable for hydrogen than electric. The advantage of hydrogen is that you can fill a truck up and it can run many hundreds of kilometers before needing to be filled, whereas an electric truck will need to be refilled every 300, 400 kilometers, and it takes potentially an hour to recharge that truck. Again, I'm skeptical as to whether that's a major problem for electric versus hydrogen. The trouble with hydrogen is there's a lot of energy conversion losses. So both the electric truck and the hydrogen truck are both using renewable electricity fundamentally. It's just that the hydrogen truck will have taken that renewable electricity, will have converted it into hydrogen, will have had to then, which creates some losses. You'll then have to compress it into a highly compressed form before you can then put it in the truck fuel tank. And then the truck itself will then, if you like, convert it back through the fuel cell. So there's a huge amount of energy losses. So in simple terms, you'd need 3 times as many wind farms to power a fleet of hydrogen trucks as you would electric trucks. And I think that's the fundamental tension. So, but if you have vehicle uses where you don't have the ability to recharge your vehicle readily and easily overnight, then there could well be an opportunity for hydrogen. And I know that, as I said, I talked about mining operations and those kind of operations which are remote and hard to access charging facilities.
Guy, I'd love to get your thoughts on that too. The uses that you see for it. Do you agree with what Simon's just said? Do you see any other uses there? Any differences in opinion?
Yeah, I mean, kind of broadly, we think broadly in a similar way, and it's kind of an economic construct. What makes the most sense. The only proviso is it's the economics of hydrogen are still emerging and the technology's nascent. So it's really hard to be definitive. But yeah, I think, and a lot of us think that hydrogen doesn't fix everything, and it doesn't make sense to use it for all sorts of use cases. So where you can electrify things, it's always first best. So to electrify your home, if you can use heat pumps for heating, and even a lot of process heat, direct electrification makes sense. Where you get to it at the end of some of the continuum is there are a lot of cases still that are really hard to deal with, and it's those cases that hydrogen's got a real role. And in some of them, in those chemical and process applications, like making steel, currently emits a hell of a lot of carbon into the atmosphere to make steel. Using hydrogen as a reductant would mean you'd be emitting water vapor. So there's cases like that electricity just doesn't work for. Shipping, transport where you're moving a really large mass, that's where electricity and batteries stop working, because you end up moving your battery and you're not really moving your payload. So there's a lot of thinking around the heaviest of the heavy transport fleet is where hydrogen really comes into its own. So marine, and I think the court's out on trucking. There are a few trucking trials at the moment going on in New Zealand with different people. Hearing are one of them, and Richardson Group down in Southland, they're trialling a blend of ammonia firing within their current truck fleet, kind of like a hybrid version. So you can take a baby step to decarbonise your trucking fleet by kind of co-firing with diesel. So I think time will tell. It's hard to. I think the ends of the continuum are kind of clear, but that middle ground, it's still there's still a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point that you make there, that we're at the beginning of this journey of looking at hydrogen and where it can go. So there is still a lot of question marks and things that we are figuring out. Guy, Meridian is looking at this. There's the Meridian and Contact joint venture known as Southern Green Hydrogen. So tell me a bit more about that project and where is it at?
So this project started about 2 years ago when the aluminium smelter declared they were closing up shop in Southland. And me and my team had a look at, along with the Contact crew, we're looking at what are the alternatives, to replace that load, really. And after quite a lot of work, all roads ended up leading down to this idea around a large-scale hydrogen facility. That was the hypothesis. We tested that. We tested that first with McKinsey's before we got stuck into it, and they came back and broadly agreed that New Zealand does have like this sort of window of opportunity. In the longer run, if you look at the market for hydrogen, it's the numbers coming out of Japan, South Korea, are mind blowing. How much they think they need, given they don't really have natural resources that are renewable. So in the long run, you could see deserts covered in solar power and massive scale to support that type of market. But while this market's kind of getting established, they agreed, and it's been pretty much confirmed in our view by the amount of interest we've had in the project. So over the last year, we've run an international tender. We got about 80 organisations respond. We've shortlisted it down. And then we're down to the final 2. So by the end of this year, we will choose our development partner, so that next year we're into the meat and potatoes. We're designing, we're trying to figure it out, and the focus will be international, but with an eye on the domestic market, so that when it matures, that you've got the ability to supply hydrogen or ammonia locally. So towards the end of this year, we'll have an announcement to make around who our preferred developer is, and who we'll be working alongside for the next couple of years as we our intent is still to push this project through and get it done. And we've given ourselves some pretty short times to get things kind of moving. So our time to get this thing to like a financial close, to make a decision on whether this goes ahead or not, it's 2 years from once we hit go on a development partner. So should we all go next year? And it's really exciting doing something that you're not 100% sure how to do. And it gets people out of bed for sure, trying to figure out how to crack interesting, not just technical problems, but commercial challenges, that basically stringing together what will be a large-scale local facility, but with joint venture partners, quite possibly in Japan or South Korea. So something that we've certainly not done before, which is why we're looking at international partners to help.
I love this. So by the end of the year, it's already October. So we're talking a matter of weeks. I am excited. I can't wait to hear who you go with. There is, of course, you mentioned there the TY Point aluminium smelter, and we've all seen the very public back and forth of they're leaving the country, they're not leaving the country, they're leaving the country, they're not leaving the country. And often slightly seems that they're playing a bit of a dance in order to get the best electricity price. And so there are some that say that the Southern Green Hydrogen Project is one way to put pressure on the TY Point aluminium smelter and get a decent electricity price out of them. What do you think of that theory?
I mean, that's certainly, that's true to a degree, but it's not the motivation really. You don't really get motivated to work hard to do something that's just a stalking horse. So we believe, and who knows what Rio Tinto will decide to do. They haven't decided what they're going to do, and they've got form. So who really knows? So we think it's better to take your destiny into your own hands and create a real alternative. And the more we look at it, there's a lot to like about it, and a lot of the aspects, particularly, and it's kind of a complicated one to explain, but the way a hydrogen facility would interact with our electricity system is markedly different to an aluminium smelter. So an aluminium smelter likes to run 24/7, 365, like a big fat rectangle of power consumption, irrespective of what's going on in New Zealand, and especially in terms of our dry year risk and our hydrology. So every number of years, I won't pick a number, but 3, 4, 5 years, we tend to go through periods where we have droughts and the electricity system's kind of short of hydropower. And the design of a hydrogen facility that we've got in mind, and Simon's team have had a look at this for us and done some independent modelling, is to design it so that the plant will actually turn down during a dry year, and therefore kind of essentially providing electricity back to New Zealand consumers. And that's quite a different kind of operational mode to how an aluminium smelter works. And when you think of how does New Zealand solve its dry year issue, it's not straightforward. And some of the options that are coming out are, large scale pumped storage hydro schemes, which seem large and risky and expensive. If we can break that problem down to small bits, and demand side management looks like a real good opportunity. So that's one thing that from a electricity, because we're an electricity company, that we're really interested in that part of it, not just the product it makes and selling a product overseas. That's the way it works in our energy system.
That's really interesting there that you mentioned, the difference in how the smelter and plant would work in terms of the demand usage. So is it possible to have both the smelter and a green hydrogen plant running in Southland, or would it have to be either or?
That's a question that's asked a lot. We believe that it all depends on scale, and it depends on timing, and it depends on the investment you put in behind it. So if you project out into the future, I think that's entirely possible to have both things running. The trick is how do you kind of bring them together in a way that it doesn't create kind of transition risk and for the electricity system, because they're quite large and lumpy. So we've been thinking hard about if for example a smelter did decide to stay, how would you kind of step in a hydrogen facility so that it was you could then build wind in behind it, and so that the two things kind of get developed in sync. But you couldn't drop in a massive scale hydrogen facility alongside a large scale aluminium smelter without a bunch of investment, particularly in that Southland region. So we have to think hard about how do you make that work in a transitional sense.
Interesting stuff. And Simon, you referenced this earlier in our chat, and I'd like to come back to it because I think it's a really important point. One of the criticisms of green hydrogen is that you use electricity to make it. So you have the cost of electricity. Then you also have the cost of making the hydrogen. You lose some energy in the process of making it all. All up, you're getting a somewhat expensive fuel at the end of this process, and certainly a very processed fuel, which can be limiting. Is there a way around all of that?
Short answer, no. I mean, it's hard to fight physics. These are basic physics, the losses. To Guy's point, or discussion, or something I'd like to develop is I don't think people realize how lucky we are in New Zealand with our renewable portfolio. And so in general, because we've got a lot of existing renewables and cheap renewable potential from wind and solar, in most cases for New Zealand, where we use fossil energy at the moment, I think going to direct electric is the best option. Where it's hard to electrify, that's where I think is the opportunity for hydrogen. But some countries are not lucky, and Guy mentioned Japan and South Korea, and they don't have the large amounts of renewable opportunities. So if they want to decarbonize, they have to either they need to import renewable energy from somebody else, and so that could be from New Zealand, it could be from Australia, it could be from the Middle East, or Australia and Middle East solar. They could also hydrogen is also competing with nuclear power there, and it's interesting that the Japanese government's started to try and reinvigorate its nuclear program. But back to your question, Francis, a lot of the challenges with hydrogen are down to basic physical processes where there are just inherent losses. So I mentioned for transport, you need 3 times as much renewable electricity for a hydrogen vehicle, for an electric vehicle. For space heating, with comparing against heat pumps, you need 5 times as much. And for basic process heat boilers of the kind Fonterra uses, you probably need twice as much. Plus, you get a lot of additional infrastructure costs along the way if you're piping the hydrogen, whereas with electricity, we already have an existing electricity grid.
Yeah, Simon, you mentioned there about, other international markets. Yeah, and New Zealand, certainly not the only country eyeing up opportunities with hydrogen. Australia, Middle East, both looking at it seriously. So what is the international competition like in this area? Does that change things for us in terms of if we're looking to make this a thing that we produce and then export, how much does that international competition impact?
In the long term, it could make a big impact. And I think the biggest competing sources of hydrogen are going to be solar-derived hydrogen from the likes of Australia or the Middle East. And there are some very low-cost projections coming out for how much solar power in these countries is going to cost. But as Guy said, Japan and South Korea have got such a huge mountain to climb that there may still be opportunity for other producers. It's a may, however, and I don't know enough or haven't looked enough as to, what's the full size of likely demand from Japan and Korea relative to the full potential from these other competing sources. But if Mitsubishi or some other overseas corporation wants to invest a lot of money in New Zealand to produce hydrogen, why not? But as long as it's there money at risk rather than our money at risk, if you like.
I always much prefer someone else's money being at risk than my own.
Yeah.
I would entirely agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, Guy, what sort of, we've talked already before on here about this is very early stages market. We are still figuring out how this technology, how this fuel could work. So do we have markets yet? If we were to start producing hydrogen now, are the markets there now? If not, how long do we think it might take for a realistic, sustainable market to emerge?
This is the ultimate question. So from the work we've done, we're confident we could build a plant. I don't think, because it's an engineering job, and New Zealanders are, by and large, pretty good at engineering. But who's going to buy the product is the question. So within our project, what we're really trying to achieve is to test that market. So the Japanese government is saying by 2030 they want to have 3 million tonnes of ammonia imported into that country. That's around 6 times the volume that we could produce out of what we were envisaging our kind of endpoint being. So they're talking a large game. So our primary job at the start of this project next year is not just to work out how to build and construct and operate this thing safely, but is to test the market for this. And yeah, I've kind of got a similar view in terms of my capital at risk, but I also think if we're going to do a project like this, it should have a big NZ component to it. So if it's successful and you can present something back to this country that has a long-term offtake with a highly creditworthy Japanese counterparty that looks like it's a pretty de-risked opportunity, then the opportunity for Kiwis to invest, I think, is important to have the option for. Otherwise, we've got a similar situation to Rio, where it's an overseas company, and they kind of, they do what they want with it, and the profits go offshore. So we're really looking to construct something that has, foreign equity at risk, because you want other people's skin in the game, but an opportunity for Kiwis to do well if this thing makes sense. So yeah, some kind of it's an NZ Inc. I think if we can't achieve an NZ Inc. Option, then we've failed, in my view.
I love that. I love the backing for New Zealand there. All right, we're going to jump into audience questions because there are heaps. And I would say for anyone who hasn't chucked their question in, use the Ask a Question button. Get that question in there, but also don't forget to upvote the ones that you want to see answered so that I know which ones to put priority on, because we can't always get to everyone, and I want to make sure your burning questions are the ones that we get through first. So I am going to start with the one that has 4 upvotes first, and I'm going to send it your way, Guy, because I imagine that you know the competitors in this area. So which companies are set to produce this green hydrogen?
In New Zealand, I guess, is that it?
Yeah, let's say which specific companies in New Zealand, and then if you know of sort of any big ones overseas, give them a quick shout out too.
So I think the player in New Zealand that's put a lot of work into the hydrogen space is Heringa, and they're a good crew. They've really got a transport oriented play in mind, so heavy trucking, and also kind of distribution around that. There's the first actually electrolyser built in New Zealand is from Tuarapaki Trust, so they're a Māori corporation based in Mokai, and they've got a geothermal power station, and they with a work with Obayashi out of Japan, they've got a megawatt, which is not big in the scheme of things, but still a brave first step. And they're producing green hydrogen at the moment. So there are a couple of players kind of doing it. We're still trying to do it. We haven't got plant operational, so you have to take your hat off to people who have kind of got in there and got stuck in. Then internationally, all the energy companies are all interested in green hydrogen, and also a lot of petrochemical firms, because they can kind of see their core product is kind of finite, really. If you're in the fossil fuel business, eventually, or all roads lead to an end. And so a lot of those companies are looking at how do they move from kind of oil and gas into moving a green fuel around the globe, which is some form of hydrogen-based fuel.
And this one from Bevan, I'm also going to send your way, Guy. What extra costs are involved if Meridian redirects energy produced at Manapōuri site towards H2 production?
What extra costs are involved? Can you run that by me again?
Yeah, no worries. So what extra costs involved if Meridian redirects energy produced at Manapōuri site towards H2 production?
Okay, I think I can. I'm not sure exactly what so we are looking at. So Manapōuri is currently kind of wired right into that kind of Tiwai Peninsula. So that the location we're looking at for this project is in and around the area, so that the infrastructure is all there. And part of what makes that part of the world attractive is A, there's generation, B, there's the transmission infrastructure is really resilient because it was built for this big smelter back in the 60s and 70s. There's a port, there's water, and the land, there's a lot of industrial zone land. So that's where we're looking in order to keep the costs down. The project's looking at around about $2 billion. That's the kind of scale of what a 600 megawatt plant would look like. But if we find a smelter is still resident in New Zealand in a few years' time, then it's likely this thing would be built in stages rather than as a large lump to replace that smelter. So it's hard to be definitive around that cost thing because the answer is it kind of depends.
Yeah, a few factors in the mix there. All right, well, we'll send this one your way, Simon. A great question here from Tim. Does it make commercial sense to only operate electrolyzers when electricity is cheap, aka highly renewable? I understand the capital cost of an electrolyzer is high and you would normally want to operate it 24/7. What do you make of that?
Yeah, good question. And it goes to this that the main competitor for green hydrogen is directly using that cheap renewable electricity, which is why in many cases for heating and for car transport and the like, it probably doesn't make sense to use green hydrogen. But as I say, where it's hard to electrify, then green hydrogen can be a good option. Yeah.
Yeah. I could kind of add a little bit to that because a lot of the projects that people are looking at offshore, say a solar plant, there's a big capital cost in plants. So if you build a plant yay big, if you plug it into, say, a solar facility, a really great solar facility in New Zealand operates around about 20% capacity factor. So on average, 20% of the time, because it doesn't work at night, and then during the day it's got a shape to it. So the challenge with some of the other projects we're seeing internationally is that the renewable energy source coming in doesn't operate, it hasn't got great uptime compared to what we can achieve in New Zealand, which is part of, I guess it's the competitive advantage Simon talked about, which is our power system is it's approaching 90% renewable anyway. So what we can offer is really high uptime on that capital invested.
Another one here from Tim, and I will send this your way, Guy. Will using electricity to create hydrogen increase electricity prices for electricity consumers?
So there's kind of two answers to that. As demand goes up, prices rise. However, what caps prices is, in the long run, is what does it cost to build a new plant? And so when we look across the country, and we're in the development space, we see a lot of opportunity for new renewable energy at a similar and reasonably low cost. So in the long run, most analysts that look at electricity prices forecast prices to actually reduce over time in real terms. The immediate challenge we all have is post-COVID and post the war in Ukraine and inflation going rampant globally. Renewable energy costs have gone up for the first time in probably over a decade. So the cost of building new wind and solar has gone up. the expectation is the investment behind all the plant that needs to build new solar and wind will continue and costs will come down again. But there's been, a real blip in costs over this last 12-month period alone. But yeah, in the longer term, the forecast is still, and this a lot of this plays to Simon's strength, is that is the cost of forecast to come down because unit costs are expected to reduce.
Well, that seems like a great time to lead into this question from Charles, and I will send this to both of you, but we'll start with you, Simon. What government policies and support would you like to see in this area? I mean, for the first place, Simon, do you think there should be government policies and support?
Well, I think the principal government policy that's required we already have in place, which is the emissions trading scheme and the carbon price that comes from it. I think there's also a role for government support in so-called infant technology, so technologies which are at the early stages of development. I think there's already been government money put in for heavy trucks in that sense. I think there could be a role for some government support in exploring some of the things around green steel for our Glenbrook steel mill. The devil's always in the detail when you're giving out government money, and so I think it's going to be very situation specific as to the different use cases. But our carbon price is already transforming our economy. Guy mentioned we're getting close to, we're about 85% renewables at the moment. Our analysis says we're going to be purely on carbon price at the moment, getting almost 99% by the end of the decade. That'll make New Zealand the second most renewable country after Iceland, and that's purely because of this carbon price. And I think that will also help incentivize hydrogen where it's likely to be economic to use it.
Iceland, we're coming for you. All right, Guy, your thoughts on that?
I'm philosophically, I'm not a massive fan of subsidies because government money is actually our money, and I think it's easily, it's easy for that to not quite go to the sweet spot. And I think commercial entities that are spending kind of shareholders' money and are just a bit more attuned to kind of that, that risk and opportunity better. So I think the role for government's much more around enabling. It's making sure the regulations or the legislative frameworks are all kind of right, and there's no unintended roadblocks. Simon's right that the ETS is there, which gives them a price on carbon. Which the challenging part of that is it's not ubiquitous. So that some sectors aren't exposed to that, and so that's part of making sure there's an even playing field and all kind of sources of emissions. So, for example, fertilizer doesn't attract a carbon charge, and if it did, then that might change the way people think about fertilizer importation and manufacture. So, I think the government's role is all about that kind of that structural stuff, rather than direct picking winners.
And great one here as well from Sebastian. Simon, I'm going to send it your way. Is the technology for hydrogen storage and shipping, replacement of processes there yet? What about in terms of the economic feasibility?
The technology is there. It's just compressing a gas after all. But as your questioner said, it's all down to the economics. It's very expensive. One of the challenges with hydrogen is its volumetric energy density is relatively poor compared to, say, natural gas. So we have a natural gas storage reservoir in Taranaki, the Aharoa gas reservoir. It can, in theory, you could potentially use that to store hydrogen, but the same volume of hydrogen gas only has 1/3 of the amount of energy of natural gas. So you'd need 3 times as much storage facilities to store the same amount of energy. The other challenge with hydrogen is it's a tricky little molecule. It's the tiniest one there is, and so it can escape through materials. So you need to invest in additional infrastructure to make these storage vessels non-permeable. You don't want a flammable gas leaking out, and that's also one of the challenges with hydrogen in vehicles. And one of the concerns is that you have the potential for example, a car in a garage being left for several months, and you slowly get a build-up of hydrogen if you're not careful.
That certainly seems like a problem that we would like to avoid. All right, we're going to do a super fast last question. This one from Robert, and I'm going to send it your way as well, Simon. Major emphasis on transport in New Zealand is trucking. Are there viable options for continuing electrification of the rail system and replacement of diesel trains with alternative sources of power?
Yes. What's interesting with electrification of rail is that that can be quite expensive, electrifying the whole route, but increasingly overseas they're developing additional options, battery electric trains with so-called catenary overhead wires to recharge as you go along at various points along the network. You don't need to electrify the whole network. Again, it comes down to the specifics of the rail system. So I think some overseas rail networks, transcontinental, might be quite hard to electrify in that sense, but the shorter or medium distances that we have in New Zealand may be more feasible for electrifying through those routes.
All right. Fascinating stuff. Well, thank you for tuning in, everyone. And thank you for everyone who submitted a question and who upvoted those questions. Because, of course, as you can see, for those who are tuning in live here, I haven't been able to get to all of them, but I have got through the ones that got the most upvotes. So thank you guys for all joining in and letting me know what are your top concerns. I hope that we got through those big questions for you. And, of course, big thank you to Guy and Simon for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
No worries. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you, Francis.
Now, we will, of course, be back here next Thursday for another shared lunch where we will be discussing ESG investing and asking the question, is it a legit way of investing, or is it, frankly, little more than a scam? There is a link to register for that in the chat. Now, it is undoubtedly going to be a great conversation, so sign up. Until then, enjoy the rest of your week. Do stay safe.